Please welcome Mike Quigley.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that very kind introduction, especially the nice words about my management style. I presume I'll get home and thank my wife, because I presume that was who the quote was from. It is, as you all know, I certainly am enthusiastic about this project, but there's always a question. People can be wildly enthusiastic, but not right. So I'm hoping by the end of today I'll have at least convinced you partly that this is a good thing for the country. So let me first thank all of you for inviting me to the Melbourne Press Club this afternoon. I suspect you might have invited me because there's so little media coverage of the NBN these days, and it's high time you got to ask a few questions. So, of course, I'm not being serious. The question of media coverage of the NBN is something I'd like to talk about today, given the audience that we have here. But first, I want to give you a brief update of the project. I want to talk about some of the more fanciful claims that are made about the NBN and perhaps blow away some myths. And I would like to take the time to explain why there still is some confusion about what it is that we're doing and take that head on. But most importantly, I'd like to address and try to answer the question which you posed in your invitations, which is why $27 million of taxpayer investment is important for our country's future. So firstly, to the NBN itself and what are we doing? It's now about just over 18 months since we really got the company going, and we've made some progress in that time. If you would ask me what have we done in those last 18 months, it's been really about building a telco, and that's what we're about. People often focus on construction, but what we are doing is we are building a telco. We have got to design a network, build a network, and then operate the network and set up all the systems to do that. That is more than just people seem to focus just about the construction side of it. That is one part. And in fact, it's to some extent the easier part of it. It's a lot of work. We're going to be passing 6,000 homes a day when we really get into volume ramp. But when you pass them, you've actually got to connect them all up and then operate it and provide services at a wholesale level. So the construction part is only one part of it. What we've now done is we've launched 3 NBN, what we call first release sites in Tasmania, and we are nearing completion of the construction of the 5 mainland first release sites in Armidale, Townsville, Kiama Downs, here in Brunswick, in Melbourne, and in Wollonga in South Australia. We expect to be turning on the first services, operating with some of our retail service provider partners at the end of April, up in some of those first release sites. This will be the first time we're really getting customers onto what is the final architecture of the systems. We'll start with a handful of customers and then obviously ramp into several hundred test customers. As I mentioned, we are focused on much more than just construction. That is one part. And in fact, the large construction job, we'll likely outsource to the contracting industry in the company, whereas the design and the operations of the network will be what is at the heart of the company in its long-term evolution. We're also quite well developed in the back-end systems that you need to run such a network as this. That are all the things that activate, assure, all of the billing you need to do. These are quite complex systems that sit behind what you will see as the NBN roll out, and we're getting on with that. On the commercial side, as all of you know, we're engaged in rather a complex negotiation with Telstra on the definitive agreements. We signed a financial heads of agreement some time ago, and we're now working through all of the complex detail of converting that financial heads into a true definitive agreement. And if completed, and if ratified by Telstra shareholders, that will mean a sensible reuse of the Telstra infrastructure across the country, which means less disruption, and obviously less disruption for communities, and obviously a reduction in our costs. What it really is the Telstra deal also means not just a reuse of that infrastructure, but also a migration of customers off the copper network, which was built starting around after the Second World War, onto a fibre network. So over a period of about a decade, it will be a replacement of today's existing copper network, which has served us well for some 60 years, but really is running out of capability as we move into more and more video technologies. So this is, I think, we're all keeping our fingers crossed that we will be able to get the deal completed with Telstra. As I said, it is complex. I've often asked the question, how can you be sure this is a good deal to do? It's because we've developed two business cases. One is a base case, which is what the world would look like without the deal, and the other one is what the world looks like with the deal, and you obviously look at the differences in those two cases to value what the deal would be worth. So we're continuing to work on that. So we've made quite some progress in the last 18 months or so, and it will be no news, I guess, to those of you who follow the NBN, that there is a lot of information in the public record already. In fact, most of it is available in lots of different forms. We've got a corporate plan which we publish now just before Christmas, and to be honest, I don't know. I can't recall of any other government business enterprise that has produced 160 pages of a business plan. Now, of course, there are some things we couldn't include in that public business case because we are still in negotiations, in tender processes, and to put that kind of information out into the public domain would mean that we'd be doing a disservice to the public in terms of not getting the best deal in the use of their money. There's also a large amount of information on our website, including all the indicative maps of where we expect to put fibre, fixed wireless and satellite. And you can go there and also find lots of very detailed documents, if you're interested, in architectures and product descriptions and a lot of technology stuff. We also make a big effort to try and keep the marketplace, the industry and the public informed. So we've done a lot of public industry engagement sessions, many of these all around the country. We also have a statutory obligation to a number of external bodies. We're subject to audit by the National Audit Office. We have to furnish ASIC with our annual results and keep them up to date about things like shareholder equity injections and any changes in directorship. And our shareholder ministers, which is Minister Conroy and Minister Wong, also expect us to act in accordance with legislation before the Parliament. So we need to supply and inform the ACCC of our pricing and the terms and conditions of supply of all of the services we'll be providing to retail and wholesale service providers. And we need to publish that information. And then there's Parliament. Bismarck once said that laws are like sausages, it's better not to see them being made. Well, having now spent a lot of time in Canberra, I think I now understand what he meant by that comment. There's certainly now for us a very large and increasing number of avenues for which we're being examined and investigated, and I think that's a good thing. We've got the Senate Committee on Communications and Environment. We've got the House of Representatives Committee on Infrastructure and Communications. We've got the Regional Telecommunications Independent Review Committee, and now, that's been set up recently, the Joint Parliamentary Committee on the NBN. So we have quite a number of committees looking at all of the activities of the NBN. Now, this is on top of the Senate estimate processes, which take place every 4 months or so. I have made sure I've turned up personally to answer questions at Senate estimates every single estimate that's taken place since I've been in the job. While the estimate process allows scope for kind of widespread questioning, and I'm sure those of you who are riveted whenever you attend an estimates process and see how it all runs out, but my experience is it's really not the best place to explore often the complex issues surrounding this intersection of technology and policy matters and the interplay that goes on. So there is, though, fortunately, I think it's fortunate, there's also a process for questions on notice. So questions that don't get asked in the Senate estimates process itself can be put to the various agencies, and they answer them over the next month or two. And these questions on notice, they're interesting. I think it's a good thing, but it does give you some pause for thought. So in the communications portfolio, in other words, those things that surrounding Senator Conroy's portfolio, There are a number of agencies, and the numbers of questions on notice from the last one, the ACMA was asked 2 questions on notice, SBS was asked 2, Australia Post was asked 17, the ABC was asked 22, and NBN Co was asked 202. Now, I understand why it's necessary to provide such detailed information, and we are glad to do so, and we think it's a good thing, but it is also clear that some of these questions are very detailed. They're not things that can just be answered by kind of the government relations people. They have to be answered by the engineering folks, the construction folks. There's a lot of people inside the company that get involved in that. So we absolutely don't shy away from our responsibility to give a good account to the public of what it is that we're doing, how we're managing the project. We are very conscious that we've been entrusted with taxpayer money, and we know it is a lot of money. So it is absolutely proper that a company such as ours should be subject to very tough questions and some very rigorous debate. And so I welcome once again today an opportunity to field your questions. But as we're doing all of this, answering all these questions, going to all these inquiries, we do still have to get on and design, build and operate a network, and we can't lose sight of that. There are, in fact, some who would like to see us act like a government department. In fact, kind of almost treat us like a government department, but that's not what we are. We're a company we were a start-up, got going some 18 months ago, almost to a person. We're people who've come from the commercial world. Most of us with experience in telco, not all, but most, but almost all of us have come out of the commercial world. Myself, I was involved in the commercial world for some 36 years in telco before I joined NBN. Now, just in terms of myths and misconceptions, frankly, despite all of the information we have provided and continue to provide, there is still a lot of confusion about the rationale for the project and for what we're doing. For instance, there's a continuing, which we had a discussion here just at the table, about the perception that wireless and fibre are somehow in competition. We still continue to see that. When I go to talk to the CTO of Deutsche Telekom, the CEO of France Telecom, the COO of AT&T, the CEO of British Telecom, they frankly, when I raise this issue of this debate between wireless and fibre, they laugh. They say, what is this debate about? It's a nonsense. They realise these are complementary technologies. You need both. For example, the CEO of AT&T said, we're building our mobile 4G networks as fast as we can build them. And at the same time, we're trying to shift the traffic off them onto the fixed fibre network. Why is that? Because spectrum is an extremely scarce resource, and the advent of iPads and iPhones, particularly as more and more video is shifted on networks, is overwhelming wireless networks. And so they keep building base stations, but they have to try and get that traffic off onto the fibre network. And as they build base stations, and so I hear sometimes from people saying it can all be done with wireless, we don't need any of this fibre stuff, I say, well, how are you going to keep, do you realise you've got to keep building base stations, wireless base stations? Well, yes, how do you connect them? Well, wireless. Well, no, each base station is fibred. So the signal comes back to the base station, back into the fibre network. So it's not a debate, frankly. It's a silly debate to be having. The country needs both wireless and fibre infrastructure in the place, and almost every telco in the world recognises that. So that's one of the issues that we deal with, and it's also quite clear that as video becomes a bigger and bigger part of our life, and we're seeing that with increasing government services, with education, with health. There's more and more video-type applications that will become more important. In fact, a company called Analysis Mason, which is in fact a very well-respected analysis company, it works all around the world, has done a recent study, and they're saying that the term fixed mobile conversion, which we talked about before, of people moving off the fixed network onto the mobile network, which we have seen for quite some years now. People giving up their fixed line, moving just to become wireless-only homes. They no longer have a fixed line. What they're saying now is that trend is starting to reverse. And why is it starting to reverse? Because a greater and greater percentage of what people use in their home in terms of data to their mobile devices is now actually flipping over onto their Wi-Fi, which is part of the fixed line network. It's connected with a fixed line. So they're seeing more and more data, mobile data, moving back onto the fixed network, and that, I think, is going to happen. So there's debates about that. There's also debates about public versus private investment. There is a small p political theory that says all private spending is good and all public spending is bad. I think it's that kind of thinking that was reflected in the Economics Intelligence Unit report card about how Australia was ranked, where because of the amount of government involvement in the NBN, it was ranked not so well. But we have a very interesting situation here in Australia. We've got a vast country with a rather sparse population, and we also have, I think, a cultural inclination, unlike, for example, the US, where I lived for some years, that says things like health and education services should try to be as much as you can, provided equitably across the country. So it's I think, not a surprise that the Australian government arrived at a policy that may be different to what other people have done in other parts of the world, and have decided to provide an underlying fixed line network across the country, 93% to premises with fibre and the rest with fixed wireless and satellite. And on top of that, but I want to be clear, the whole aim is to do that at the smallest possible part of the value chain. So that's what we're trying to do in NBN Co, to allow all the innovation and the competition to occur at the retail level and wholesale level above us. That's where it all takes place. Our job is just to connect bits, to do things where it just doesn't make much sense, to duplicate infrastructure. Remember, the only two real successful fixed line infrastructure builds that have occurred in Australia's history was back in, I think, 1890 in the Overland Telegraph, that was done by the South Australian government, and then in the fixed line copper network was just done after the Second World War. And on a comparable basis, the copper network per premise connected is about the same in today's dollars of what we're doing on the fibre network. So we really are replacing that copper network, which after 60 years is beginning to run out of a bit of steam. There are other models, such as in Korea, where there are 4 vertically integrated companies that are competing with each other and overbuilding each other in fixed line infrastructure. And there are, and frankly, some criticisms of that model now starting to happen, as the amount of money that has to be spent to recover the investment that each one of them have made in fixed line infrastructure. They're pouring more and more money into marketing, as you would expect, to try and grab market share. It's not a model that people are now beginning to say makes a huge amount of sense. So we expect competition and innovation to be very robust, sitting above what we're providing. And as I've also said, in fact, around the table today, a company such as NBN Co absolutely needs to be oversighted and regulated, which is why we have continued to have very close dialogue with the ACCC and try to do everything we can to keep them well informed of what we're doing. We'll be submitting a special access undertaking, and we expect a company such as NBN Co that's building this infrastructure to be obviously oversighted by the ACCC and quite strongly regulated. So what about the cost and scale? There's a kind of a more fundamental question, is it worth the money? I want to stress that the modelling that we've done in the business case, if you go and read those 160 pages, you'll find that our assumptions are based on building a telco. We haven't assumed any productivity benefits in education, in health, in cloud computing, in any other areas. We've just looked at it as a telco, as a business, where we build a network, we sell services at a wholesale level, and we get revenue. On that basis, we can provide a return that's above the government bond rate. I should comment, no commercial entity would do this. Okay, so when people say, well, this isn't a commercial proposition, my answer is, duh. Of course, it's not a commercial proposition in that sense, in the sense that a private company would use private money to invest in this. You wouldn't do it. The returns aren't large enough because you're doing it all over the country. We're putting up 2 big Ka-band satellites to provide services to the people out in the bush. So that's not a private commercial proposition. But is it a legitimate thing for the government to do? When they look at all the other benefits they'll get, I think the answer is it well may be. That is, it's certainly something that we're conscious of, and I keep repeating, our job is to execute on government policy, not to make policy, to execute on government policy, and that's what we're about. So, is it a good investment? We believe that the $27 billion that the government needs to inject into the company can be returned, will be returned over the life of the project with interest. And then, of course, there's a question for the government at the end of the day, what do they want to do with this company? Because it will be, if all is successful, quite a going concern. But our belief is a solid business case which will return the taxpayers' money to them. We are seeing a lot of interest, obviously, from people such as local council. In fact, what we found is local councils are overwhelmingly supportive of the project. Many of them are anxiously awaiting its arrival. They know what it has the potential to do for rural and regional Australia. Our problem is to try and satisfy their requirements. We've also seen from the case studies that we've done in the 3 Tasmanian towns that we have fibred, that people are already enjoying the benefits. So just, if I can read just one quote from a sign writer, David at Midway Point, who said, "In the past, some customers have thought it's too hard to physically send me their artwork files." Now, this is a sign writer, by the way, who they no longer use brushes and paints. Okay, they normally are managing big files, big artworks. So he said, in the past, it's been difficult to send these artwork files. So they choose somewhere closer. Whereas now, over the NBN, location is no longer a problem. There are no obstacles at all. I can download most of the files clients send me in seconds. And it doesn't matter how close or how far away the customer is. The possibilities are endless. This is a gentleman who was having to drive into Hobart, I think he said some 15 times a month, to transport files. He no longer has to do this. He's now getting work from overseas, which he didn't have before, because he simply couldn't service that. So there's those kind of views, but there's also views where people are saying that we should constrict what we're doing. In other words, we shouldn't be going to these places in which it is too expensive. But we're also seeing views, in fact, in one of the daily broadsheets, we're seeing the view in almost alternate days. In one case, we shouldn't be spending the money to extend. The next day, it's being argued that we're leaving the bush and we're creating a digital divide in the same newspaper on alternate days. Now, I could argue maybe that's good, that's journalistic balance. The only problem is that each of those contradictory positions is used as a reason to criticise us, what we're doing. I don't mean criticise on one side, but on both it's a bit much. And just while I'm on the subject of media coverage, here's a selection of my favourite headings. Internet piracy could be fuelled by the NBN. Telcos fear NBN will crush them. AFP raises cybercrime fears over NBN. SBS warns of a digital ghetto as a result of the NBN. Australia's NBN Co is the Trojan horse for internet censorship, and NBN Co harbours aliens. That last one I made up, but it's not that far from what we're now seeing that's taking place in the headlines. We understand, by the way, as a government-owned business operating in what is now an intensely political environment, we have been caught in the crossfires. And that, of course, is adding to the confusion. Prior to the last election, we really didn't create too much. We didn't have much of a media focus. All that changed during the course of the campaign when broadband policy emerged as one of the key differences between the two main political parties. Then there was a stalemate after the election, as we all know, and the NBN became one of the pivotal issues in the decisions of the 3 independents to support which side of politics they were going to support. So I'm now resigned to the fact that the company is going to be a live political issue for quite some time. I can't change that. But what I can do is to try and change the level of understanding about what it is we're doing and why. And it's something that we've perhaps been reticent about in the past because our focus has been on designing the network and getting our corporate plan together, building test sites, connecting up customers, trying to do the deal with Telstra. But assuming the Telstra deal goes through, and we're obviously hoping it does, We believe we have an obligation now to explain the change to people out in communities, what the NBN will bring to them. In fact, we have no choice. We're required to run a public information and education campaign that explains what we're doing. It'll explain to householders what's going to happen with migration from copper to the fibre network, what it'll do for them, what it'll do for businesses. And it's kind of an unsurprising requirement when you think about it. When the copper network does get shut down, there's a whole raft of things that have to happen. It's going to require a lot of coordinated effort between NBN Co and the retailers, and we need to explain that to people. It's not too dissimilar to the digital switchover campaign, which had to inform people what was going to happen when the analogue TV system was shut down. But this one is about their communications ability, not just television, and it's also somewhat more complex. So the campaign will be carried out in conjunction with the industry and in consultation with Commonwealth Government, obviously. It'll commence prior to the big rollout of the national network, and it will continue over the best part of a decade as we move from place to place and inform each of those local communities what we're doing. So, in conclusion, I'd say that bearing in mind that we have become a real political issue, I think by and large the coverage of NBN Co has been fairly good, particularly I'd have to say in the specialist telecommunications medium. They're the ones who have been most across all the consultations that we've done with industry and with our access seekers, and they're the ones who paid closest attention to our network and products. And I would frankly count our industry engagement, the way in which we have interacted with the industry, as one of our success stories so far. Now, of course, there's going to be different entities out there lobbying for different things in the bills, as Peter said. That's what you would expect. But overall, I think our relationship with the telecoms industry in Australia has gone pretty well. But we are going to need now to make our case not only to industry and to politicians, but also directly to the Australian people. So we welcome the scrutiny you will place us under as the media, even though sometimes we wince at some of the coverage we get. It's important that you keep scrutinising us. But it is incumbent on us to ensure that people better understand what it is we are building and how they will benefit. Because, as you know, this is a project that in the end is likely to touch the lives and businesses of just about everybody in Australia. Thank you.
Mike's agreed to take a couple of questions. Do we have any questions?
Hi, Mr. Quigley. Chip Legrand from the Australian newspaper. This is a question about the digital divide, so must be, what are we at, Tuesday? Just with that 93% figure for the fibre to go to, when you're looking at the other criteria, the science population density that you like included in making that decision on where the fibre goes and then where you rely on satellite and fixed wireless, could you walk through some of the other things you'd like to consider in terms of making those decisions as to who gets what?
Yeah, okay. The process of where those boundaries take place is largely driven, and which you're expected to be driven, on the basis of cost. So we build out what are called fibre access nodes. They're where you put the equipment down, you run the fibre out, can go out to up to 15 kilometres. And by the way, unlike DSL or copper or wireless, the mobile services, it doesn't degrade with distance, doesn't degrade with the number of people on it. So we can run 15 kilometres out. But obviously you come to a point where the density of the premises goes down, the distances you have to cover goes up for each premise, and therefore the cost of the fibre deployment goes up. And so the curve, if you plot it from kind of the first percentile all the way across, cost on the vertical axis and percentile of premises in Australia, you can plot that and it goes along, it slowly goes up, but then it starts to take a knee curve and up it shoots. Now obviously at that point the government's estimate would be that was around 90%. We proved through all the modelling, us and in fact the McKinsey implementation study came to about the same conclusion, that knee was at about 93%, where it starts to get so expensive to do those additional premises that you really need to look at another technology. So the technology to look at is fixed wireless from that point. not mobile services, fixed wireless. You're just using the spectrum, but it's just like a fixed service. You do that for about another 4%, and then beyond that it becomes even too expensive to do it with fixed wireless, and you do it with satellite. But I should mention that in the fixed wireless and the satellite, it's not just about the speeds, and we'll guarantee at least a 12 megabits per second peak speed. It's also about the throughput, and we're dimensioning the throughputs for this satellite and fixed wireless service about an order of magnitude higher than what current wireless and satellite services are. So there'll be big improvements. So there's no hard and fast algorithm that you can write. It's largely based on cost, but clearly if you're going down a street and there's a big property in the middle of properties on either side, you'll obviously do that one. So there's no hard and fast rule, but it's largely driven by cost, and you can't be absolutely precise till you go out and do the detailed design on the site. That's the only way you can do it.
Maybe a quick question. I read some time ago that there was debate as to whether NBN should be subject to Freedom of Information law.